The Atlantic was a graveyard with no headstones. In the winter of 1943, its surface boiled under iron skies, waves colliding like slabs of moving stone. A convoy of merchant ships groaned through the storm, their decks slick with ice and fear. Every man aboard knew what hid beneath them. Not sharks or whales, but predators made of steel, patient and unseen. The war's longest battlefield had no front line, only depth and silence. In the darkness below, a U-boat drifted like a ghost. Inside, the air was stale, laced with oil and sweat. Red lights flickered over faces that hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. The commander, Captain Lieutenant Weber, leaned against the periscope column, listening. The hydrophone operator shook his head. Nothing but the low moan of the ocean. Weber smiled faintly. "They'll never find us," he whispered, confident in the cloak of the Atlantic's chaos. For years, the ocean had been his ally. The British hunted with primitive sonar, guessing at echoes that could just as easily be fish or current. Weber had sunk 8 ships that way, ghosts hunting ghosts. Above, destroyers tossed depth charges like dice, praying for luck. He knew the mathematics of their failure. But tonight something was off. The pings were sharper, more deliberate. Each pulse came back cleaner, as if the enemy were not guessing anymore, but knowing. The first explosion struck near the bow. Then another, closer. The submarine shuddered, lights flickering to black. Men scrambled through narrow corridors, hands slick with oil, shouting over the roar of collapsing steel. Weber's calm cracked. He barked for a dive, deeper, faster. But the next wave came before the order finished leaving his lips. The hull screamed like a living thing. Up above, on the destroyer's bridge, an American sonar operator stared at his screen, not in disbelief, but focus. His hands adjusted a dial in tiny increments. The rhythm of the sonar wasn't random anymore. It pulsed with measured intent, the way a craftsman might test the vibration of a tuning fork. The captain watched the readout and gave the quiet order. "Mark. Fire." Depth charges rolled into the dark, detonating with precision that no one thought possible. Below, the U-boat's hull ruptured. Air, metal, and men were torn into spiraling oblivion. Weber's final thought before the sea closed over him was confusion, not fear. How had they found him so exactly? The storm raged on, indifferent. On the destroyer, the sonar operator exhaled, trembling. Somewhere deep in his machine, an electric motor, one designed decades earlier to agitate laundry, hummed steadily, untouched by the violence it enabled. The war at sea had changed that night. The Atlantic was no longer a hiding place, and the key to piercing its darkness hadn't come from a weapons lab, but from a washing machine factory that refused to think small. By 1943, the North Atlantic was not a trade route. It was a wound, open, bleeding, and widening with every lost ship. Convoys that left Halifax or Liverpool in proud procession often arrived as scattered survivors, limping into port with cargo holds empty and crews hollow-eyed. The sea itself seemed to conspire against the Allies. It wasn't only the storms or the cold, it was the silence. That lethal silence where U-boats thrived unseen. Each U-boat was a wolf, guided by mathematics and menace. They hunted in packs, the infamous Rudel tactics, slipping through the convoys at night, periscopes rising like thin blades through the water. The first torpedo would always be a surprise, the second a punishment, the third an exclamation mark. A single submarine could halt an entire supply line, its commander armed with patience and a stopwatch. Inside Allied war rooms, the maps looked like crime scenes. Strings stretched across oceans, red pins marking losses. Every morning began with fresh updates, new sinkings, new coordinates, new regrets. Admirals traced the convoy routes with trembling fingers, as if willing their men to move faster, think smarter, be luckier. Yet luck was the only variable left. The equipment that was meant to give the Allies an edge, the sonar, or ASDIC as the British called it, had become both savior and scapegoat. It was technology born of optimism and undone by reality. The idea was simple. Send a sound pulse into the sea, wait for its echo to bounce off a submarine's hull. But the Atlantic did not play fair. Temperature layers bent sound like glass, salinity blurred it, and the endless roar of the sea filled every silence with ghosts. Operators listened to static that mimicked enemies. They chased shadows that weren't there, and when they ignored them, those shadows killed. To the admirals, it was a paradox too cruel to bear. They had built the most powerful fleets in history, armed with radar, depth charges, and hundreds of destroyers. Yet a single German captain with a small steel tube could render them helpless. The contrast was obscene, might without precision, mass without clarity. Commanders grew weary, analysts defensive. The Navy's reports spoke in euphemisms: contact lost, target inconclusive, possible false return. But everyone knew what it meant. We heard them. Then we lost them, and now they've killed again. In Washington, one staff officer described the Atlantic as a chessboard where the enemy plays in 3 dimensions, and we play blindfolded. He wasn't wrong. The ocean's physics were the enemy's greatest ally, its depth, its pressure, its deceitful silence. Engineers called it the acoustic jungle. Admirals called it something simpler: hell. In the London Underground, the Western Approaches Command kept a wall-sized map of convoy movements, updated hourly. Women in uniform slid magnetic counters across the board, their faces lit by dull lamps. Each piece of glass represented a ship, each erasure a loss. You could hear the pencils scratching like insects in the quiet between air raid sirens. The officers pacing behind them weren't generals in the romantic sense. They were clerks of catastrophe, measuring defeat in tonnage. Desperation grew scientific. British and American laboratories experimented with new hydrophones, frequency filters, and mathematical models to predict where U-boats might hide. But the data lied as much as it revealed. The ocean was not a lab. It was chaos wrapped in pressure and cold. Each test that worked in a tank failed at sea. The pattern eluded them because it was not a pattern. It was a living resistance. The Admiralty tried everything else: more escort ships, faster convoys, aircraft patrols. None of it solved the core problem. You can't fight what you can't find. The men tasked with saving the convoys had begun to doubt not just their machines, but the very idea that the ocean could ever be understood. And yet, amid that despair, a strange thought began to surface. Whispered, dismissed, then whispered again. Maybe the solution wouldn't come from the Navy at all. Maybe the problem wasn't the ocean. Maybe it was how they were listening to it. In one late-night meeting, as exhausted officers argued over sonar calibration charts and casualty reports, a quiet voice broke the noise. An engineer, still in his oil-stained overalls, looked up from the clutter of graphs and said, almost to himself, "If our machines can't hear them." He paused, eyes narrowing, tracing the looping line of a distorted sonar return. Who can build one that can? The room fell silent. No one answered. But that question, simple, heretical, and absurd, would soon echo from the polished floors of the Admiralty to the humming floors of a factory that had never built a weapon in its life. The Bendix factory in South Bend, Indiana, smelled of oil, soap, and steel. On the assembly floor, rows of women in headscarves and men in grease-stained shirts guided humming machines that had nothing to do with war. Not yet. Motors whirred, drums spun, and test benches clicked like metronomes. They built the steady, faithful rhythm of post-war America before it ever arrived. Washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and timers so precise they could outlast the patience of their users. When the Navy first arrived, the place seemed almost comic. 2 officers in crisp uniforms stood in a corridor lined with laundry agitators. The plant foreman, wiping his hands on a rag, tried to explain the difference between a 60 Hz motor and an induction coil as the officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them muttered, "We're fighting a war, not cleaning shirts." The other said nothing. He was listening, not to the man, but to the sound of the machines. There was a rhythm in the room, a hum that felt oddly alive. Controlled, predictable, perfectly stable. That was the miracle. In the Navy's world, stability was the rarest currency. Every sonar pulse they sent into the sea scattered in unpredictable chaos, distorted by temperature and motion. But here in a civilian factory surrounded by enamel tubs and motor shafts, sound was mastered. Not silenced, not guessed at, controlled. A few weeks earlier, a requisition memo from the Navy's Bureau of Ships had arrived at Bendix by bureaucratic accident. The Navy wanted precision timers for a new kind of sonar testing device. The memo landed on the desk of a young engineer named Harold Black, who had no clearance, no naval experience, and no idea his reply would start an unlikely alliance. His team delivered not just timers but a proposal, one that suggested they could build something far more sophisticated. A frequency-variable oscillator capable of modulating sound in fluid environments. The Navy's scientists scoffed. Sound in air and sound in water were different beasts, but Black insisted that mechanical precision doesn't care what it's moving through. Whether water or detergent, the principle was the same. Balance, rotation, rhythm. Bendix's washing machines didn't just spin. They maintained harmony under chaotic loads. If that precision could be tuned to sonar frequencies, perhaps the sea's chaos could be tamed too. So, in a corner of the Bendix plant, where agitator drums once tumbled test linens, a new experiment began. Engineers rewired control units, replacing fabric with fluid, soap with saline. Oscillators pulsed instead of spinning. The first prototypes looked laughable. Metal frames held together by household parts, wires bundled with masking tape, the faint smell of detergent still clinging to their casings. Yet when they flicked the switch, something extraordinary happened. The oscillation remained pure, unbroken even through vibration. Word spread quietly through naval research circles. Admirals began visiting under the cover of industrial inspection. They stood awkwardly beside factory workers in denim aprons, staring at machines that looked more suited for laundry day than warfare. But the data was undeniable. The Bendix oscillator maintained a frequency stability no naval instrument had ever achieved. In those humming coils, the Navy found what their laboratories could not: mechanical discipline born from domestic necessity. Washing machines had to survive unbalanced loads, random resistance, unpredictable weight. The same problems sonar faced in the Atlantic. What Bendix had built for mothers and households turned out to be the perfect analog for the sea's chaos. By spring, a quiet contract was signed. The admiral stopped laughing, and in the machine that once kept laundry from tangling, they saw something far stranger: the blueprint of a weapon. One engineer would later describe that day in his journal with a single line: "What if the same principles that agitate laundry could agitate the ocean, just enough to reveal what hides beneath it?" Sound in the ocean behaves like light in a hall of mirrors. It bends, scatters, and deceives. A sonar pulse doesn't travel straight. It ricochets between thermal layers, refracts through salt gradients, and fades into 1,000 ghosts. To a sonar operator, every echo was a half-truth, every silence a potential lie. That was the cruel symmetry of the Atlantic War. The ocean could amplify a whisper or swallow a scream, depending on nothing more than temperature and chance. For the Navy, the rule was sacred: silence is survival. Every escort ship trained its sonar operators to send brief pings, then wait. The less you disturbed the sea, the clearer the response. Or so the doctrine went, but it wasn't working. Submarines slipped between the pulses, vanished into the lull between seconds. In that quiet they struck. At Bendix, the young engineers couldn't let go of a simple subversive thought. What if silence was the problem? Harold Black and his team began sketching sound as rhythm instead of signal, a dance rather than a tap. They filled chalkboards with waveforms, their curves looping like ocean currents. The solution they proposed wasn't to whisper to the sea, but to speak its language, and continuously, dynamically, unpredictably. They called it variable frequency modulation. Instead of one tone bouncing off a target, Their machine would sweep through frequencies, mapping how each one bent and returned. By analyzing the distortions, you could infer not just that something was there, but what it was: metal, rock, whale, or submarine. To them it was obvious. To the Navy it was heresy. When they presented the idea at the Bureau of Ships, the room felt colder than the ocean itself. Admirals sat in rigid silence as the engineers described a sonar that deliberately introduced noise into its own signal. "Controlled noise," one officer repeated, half incredulous. "You're proposing we make detection harder to make it clearer?" Black tried to explain it through metaphor. "Sir, think of it like light through fog. If you flash once, you see only haze. But if you sweep the beam, across angles, across intensities, the fog reveals its depth." Another officer cut in. "And what happens when the enemy hears that sweep?" "You'll be broadcasting our position across the Atlantic." Black met his eyes. "Maybe, but they'll be the ones running, not us." The room erupted in argument. Tradition versus innovation, silence versus signal. The Navy had been built on the former, but the war was being lost by it. To the scientists, the rule of sound was no longer sacred. It was obsolete. After hours of debate, the admirals retreated into private discussion. When they returned, their answer was reluctant but decisive. They would allow one trial, a single destroyer, one unit under controlled conditions. If the washing machine sonar, as they derisively called it, could detect a submerged target faster than the Navy's best system, they'd consider further funding. If not, the project would die quietly, like every other civilian fantasy that tried to outsmart the sea. As the officers left the room, Black remained by the chalkboard, erasing equations smudged by the sweat of his palm. Around him, the faint hum of Bendix motors echoed in his head, that steady rhythmic oscillation he'd spent his life perfecting. He turned to his team with a quiet smile. "They think we're crazy," he said. "Good, that means we're close. Outside..." Snow fell over the Indiana factory roofs, muffling every sound, except the low, mechanical heartbeat of a motor still turning in the dark. In a corner of the Bendix plant, the war began to sound different. Not in gunfire or engines, but in hums and pulses, a mechanical symphony of invention. The prototype took shape like a creature assembled from two worlds: the clean geometry of laboratory design and the improvisation of a factory floor. Aluminum plates scavenged from scrapped washing drums formed its casing. Inside, gyroscopic stabilizers, the same that kept laundry from rattling itself to pieces, steadied the sonar array against the tremors of a ship at sea. The engineers called it Project Washington, half in jest, half in reverence. Its heart was a rotating sound head, fitted with a balanced rotor that could sweep frequencies in a fluid motion, instead of the binary clicks of traditional sonar. Around it, coils wound with copper wire thinner than a human hair modulated the signal. One moment a deep growl, the next a sharp ping. They learned that the ocean, like a washing load, responded differently to agitation speeds. It was the same physics of turbulence, just translated into a deeper register. The workdays blurred into nights. Engineers and machinists labored under fluorescent halos, chalk dust, and coffee stains, marking their progress as clearly as any blueprint. Equations smeared across blackboards mixed with fingerprints on metal casings. Each adjustment, a recalibrated coil, a shaved millimeter on a bearing, felt monumental. It wasn't just science. It was craft. Yet for all its genius, the machine looked almost comical. A boxy frame of exposed wires, turning wheels, and humming transformers. It resembled something between a radio and an industrial dryer. One visiting Navy officer laughed aloud when he first saw it. "That's what's going to save our ships?" he said, shaking his head. Harold Black didn't answer. He just reached over, flipped a switch, and let the machine speak for itself. The tone began low and steady, a vibration that seemed to travel through the floor. Then it climbed, spiraling upward into a series of sweeping pitches, smooth and rhythmic. On the oscilloscope, the waveform appeared, clean, continuous, almost alive. It didn't echo like older sonars. It resonated. It could hear itself and correct in real time, filtering its own interference. An acoustic reflex born from the same feedback loops that kept washing machines balanced. The room fell silent except for the hum. One engineer murmured, "It's listening." And it was, not just to the ocean it would soon face, but to itself, to its own imperfections, constantly adjusting, learning, refining. By spring, the prototype was ready for shipment to the Navy's test range. Crated in pine and labeled with the deliberately bland code Instrument Assembly Marine, it bore no hint of its origin in soap and steel. As the truck doors closed, the team stood watching, exhausted but exhilarated. If it could survive the sea's chaos the way it survived a spin cycle, they might just change the war. The Gulf of Mexico shimmered under a harsh white sun as the corvette USS Marigold cut through the water, her bow-splitting waves the color of mercury. Below deck, the hum of an unfamiliar machine filled the sonar compartment, a mechanical heart transplanted from a world of soap and domestic calm into one of salt and pressure. The Bendix engineers stood beside it, sleeves rolled up, sweat pooling in their collars. Around them, sailors watched with folded arms and smirks. They called it the washing machine detector. The nickname spread like a stain. No one aboard trusted it, least of all the sonar operators who'd spent years relying on the familiar click-ping rhythm of their own equipment. "If this thing starts shaking like a dryer," one joked, "we'll just toss our uniforms in and call it laundry day." The laughter eased the tension, but not for the men who had built the thing. To them, every screw and solder joint was personal. The first trial began at dawn. A captured German U-boat, U-512, lay submerged a few miles out, their test ghost. The Marigold's engines slowed, propellers fading into the pulse of waves. Harold Black gave the signal. "Activate sweep." The machine began its sequence on low frequencies first, then higher, modulating in a slow, deliberate arc. For a moment, hope flickered. Then the display erupted in chaos. Echoes flooded the screen, overlapping waves of noise impossible to read. The operator slammed his headphones down. "It's blind! Can't make sense of anything." Black's heart sank. The system was too sensitive. Each pulse amplified the sea's own voice until it drowned itself. For the rest of the morning, they tried adjustments, recalibrating filters, shifting coils, rebooting circuits. Nothing worked. By noon, one of the oscillators burned out, filling the compartment with the smell of scorched insulation. The crew's mockery grew bolder. "Guess it can't handle a rinse cycle," someone shouted from the hatch. By dusk, defeat hung in the humid air. The test was supposed to last 3 days. It looked like it wouldn't survive one. Black sat on the deck staring at the horizon, replaying every calculation. Then a thought surfaced, something simple, almost embarrassing. The oscillation rate. He remembered the stabilizer units back at Bendix, how washing drums balanced themselves by adjusting rhythm, not speed. The sea wasn't static. Why should the sonar be? He ran below deck, shouting for his team. They rewired the frequency modulator, not to hold a steady tone, but to breathe, to fluctuate in rhythm, a mechanical mimicry of the ocean's own pulse. When the system restarted, the sound was different. Less clinical, more alive. The screen flickered once, twice, then steadied. Amid the noise, a shape began to form, a narrow arc, faint but deliberate, moving slowly west. The operator froze. "That's her," he whispered. The coordinates matched the U-boat's known position within 100 yards. Black said nothing. He only watched as the echo sharpened with each sweep, the machine tracking the submarine's movement with eerie grace. On deck, the crew gathered, peering at the scope's glowing line. The laughter was gone. The ocean hadn't gone silent. It had been made to speak. When the corvette dropped a marker buoy, the splash landed exactly above the U-boat. The precision was uncanny. The trial log that night recorded the detection as conclusive. But for the engineers, the data meant something simpler: vindication. As darkness fell over Key West, the Marigold drifted under stars, her hull vibrating with the hum of the machine below. Black leaned against the bulkhead, exhausted, listening to that steady pulse. Mechanical, relentless, alive. If a washing machine motor could hear through the chaos of the sea, then maybe, just maybe, submarines would never be invisible again. The Marigold's trial report reached Washington wrapped in triumph and suspicion. On paper, the results were undeniable. First, confirmed detection of a submerged target beyond visual contact, achieved by a non-standard sonar system. But in the corridors of Naval Command, innovation wasn't a victory. It was a threat. At the Bureau of Ships, the first review meeting began with silence thick enough to drown in. Admirals and career engineers studied the Bendix data as though it were a foreign language. The graphs were flawless, the conclusions unsettling. Variable frequency modulation violated every accepted principle of sonar discipline. Uncontrolled noise, one senior officer scoffed. Isn't science, but it's gambling, another added. We can't have civilians dictating naval tactics. Their voices carried the weight of habit and fear. For the Bendix team, the rejection came as a shock. They had fought the ocean and won, only to lose to paperwork. Harold Black reread the memorandum twice. Not recommended for fleet adoption at this time. Further trials unnecessary. In the margins, someone had penciled a note. Interesting, but impractical. He stared at the word for a long time. Impractical had become the graveyard where good ideas went to die. Weeks passed. The engineers wrote rebuttals, filed reports, even hand-delivered data reels to naval scientists. Nothing moved. Bureaucracy, like the sea, swallowed everything. Morale thinned. Men who'd once built machines with fire in their hands now lingered at their desks, waiting for orders that never came. The irony was cruel. Victory without permission. Progress without approval. Then, one gray morning, a telegram arrived under an unmarked envelope. It wasn't from Washington. It was from London, stamped with the discreet insignia of the Admiralty's Scientific Research Division. The message was brief. Request detailed specifications of frequency-modulated sonar device. Stop British Anti-Submarine Command interested. Stop confidential under authority of PM. Black read it twice, then handed it to his team without a word. Across the Atlantic, the British were drowning faster than the Americans. Convoys burned nightly in the Bay of Biscay. Their scientists, driven by desperation, had learned to break rules the Americans still defended. They didn't see a washing machine motor. They saw survival. Within weeks, British intelligence officers arrived in South Bend under civilian cover. Meetings took place in basements guarded by factory foremen who didn't know why. Over tea and blueprints, the Bendix engineers explained their system's logic. The British listened, really listened, and asked for integration with their own experimental project, Operation Hedgehog. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a doctrine, a way to attack before the enemy vanished. That night, as the engineers walked out of the plant, the air smelled of rain and oil. For the first time in months, they felt motion again. The Navy might have doubted them, but the war hadn't waited. Innovation had found its battlefield, not in laboratories or boardrooms, but in the desperate waters of the North Atlantic. The North Atlantic was a theater of storms, wind howling like artillery, waves slamming the hulls with the rage of a living enemy. In that gray expanse, convoy HX-229 crawled eastward, merchant ships forming a loose, shivering line. Among them, a British frigate, HMS Forester, carried something new in her belly. The Bendix frequency sweep sonar, freshly grafted into Royal Navy steel. The crew called it the Sweeper. They didn't trust it yet. The seas were monstrous, black mountains collapsing into themselves. Rain hammered the deck and the horizon vanished. Inside the sonar room, the world shrank to a single green scope and a low hum pulsing through the bulkheads. Petty Officer Alan Reeves, the ship's lead operator, leaned forward, headphones pressed tight. He'd worked with sonar before, always bursts of sound, gaps of doubt. But this pulse was different. It was alive, continuous, breathing through him like a heartbeat. Hours passed. The convoy creaked forward, steel groaning under strain. Reeves tuned the dial, sweeping the frequency through its range. At first, the ocean offered only noise, static, rain, distant whale song. But then through the clutter came a rhythm. Subtle, deliberate, a slow modulation, almost like a second pulse answering back. He froze. It wasn't random. It was movement, Captain, he called, voice low but steady. We've got something, bearing 212, range 3,000 yards. She's running silent. The bridge erupted into motion. Orders flew. The Forester swung hard to port, her deck tilting underfoot. Depth charges armed and ready. Outside, the storm intensified, as though the ocean itself were fighting back against this intrusion of order into its chaos. Reeves kept tracking, fingers adjusting the dial in micro-movements. The new system sang beneath his touch, translating chaos into coherence. The sweep curved around a thermal layer. He could see it now, not with eyes but with sound. The U-boat was climbing, unaware that its invisibility was gone. Target confirmed, Reeves said. Range closing, 2,000 yards. Stand by. Fire! The depth charges rolled into the sea, disappearing in white spray. For a moment there was only the howl of the wind. Then the sea erupted. A column of water rose, fractured by flame and metal. Moments later, oil and debris surfaced, bobbing like dark confessions. Reeves removed his headphones slowly. No cheers. Just the quiet awareness that something irreversible had happened. The Forester had hunted, not reacted. The ocean, once an accomplice to the enemy, had been turned against him. On the bridge, the captain stared out through the rain and murmured. We saw him before he saw us. Below deck, the machine hummed on. The same quiet oscillation that once spun laundry drums, now dictating the rhythm of life and death. That night, the convoy sailed on under calmer skies. Reeves wrote one line in his logbook before turning in. The sea finally spoke, and we answered. For the first time in the war, sound had become sight. By 1944, the Atlantic no longer belonged to the hunters below. It belonged to the hum, that steady, pulsing rhythm now etched into every convoy escort's heartbeat. The new sonar doctrine transformed the sea from a guessing ground into a grid. Commanders no longer waited for contact. They sought it methodically, relentlessly. The phrase "hunt by rhythm" entered naval slang, part poetry, part instruction. On the training decks at Scapa Flow, young sailors crowded around the sonar consoles, their faces pale in the green glow. Instructors taught them not to listen for sound, but to listen through it, to feel the difference between chaos and pattern. The Bendix sweep gave them that language. They spoke in frequencies, not coordinates. A small tremor in pitch meant a submarine turning. A fading resonance meant diving. The ocean had become a code, and the machine was its interpreter. Commanders learned to trust that hum more than instinct. In battle reports, they no longer wrote estimated position, but confirmed by frequency track. Machines once mocked as toys were now deciding when men lived or died. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A washing machine motor now commanded fleets. In the wardrooms, older officers struggled with the change. They'd come from an age of visual warfare, when courage was measured by proximity and sight. Now the enemy was defeated by mathematics. Equations whispered through steel. One veteran destroyer captain confided in his log, "We are no longer sailors. We are operators. The sea used to test our instincts. Now it tests our wiring." For the Bendix engineers, the success was bittersweet. Their invention, born from household precision, had become a weapon. Harold Black received letters from crews thanking him for saving their ships. He read them with quiet pride but also unease. Each success report carried a subtext he couldn't ignore. Your machine found them before they found us. What went unsaid was what followed. The detonations. The sinking hulls, the oil, the silence. In South Bend, the factory workers who had once built washing machines now assembled sonar components by the hundreds. They signed the boxes with initials half joking, half reverent. Keep them spinning, one wrote. Make it home safe. They didn't know that those same boxes would help erase entire U-boats, or that their hum would echo across oceans and years. Doctrine caught up to technology. The Allies redefined submarine warfare as an offensive defense. Instead of shielding convoys reactively, they formed hunter groups. Fast escorts equipped with the Bendix modulated sonar, coordinating depth charge attacks with surgical timing. The sea, once ruled by unseen wolves, became a listening field, every pulse a heartbeat of control. But victory came at a strange cost. The sailors felt it most, that uneasy intimacy with a machine that knew more than they did. The engineers felt it too. The weight of invention turned fatal, and somewhere in the middle, between the hum of the sonar and the silence of the deep, the war's morality blurred, precision replacing courage, rhythm replacing fear. The Atlantic today lies calm, a mirror of gray and glass concealing its violent memory. Cargo ships cross it now without escorts, without fear, their wakes vanishing into a silence once filled with screams and sonar. Yet somewhere beneath, resting in the silt, are the remnants of that invisible war. Steel hulls collapsed under pressure, engines fossilized in rust. Time has softened their menace, but not their meaning. Historians would later call it a turning point, the moment when the Allies stopped enduring the ocean and began understanding it. Not through courage or firepower, but through a pattern born in a washing machine plant in Indiana. Bendix's invention, absurd in origin, miraculous in effect, became a cornerstone of post-war sonar design. The frequency sweep principle, once laughed out of naval boardrooms, evolved into the standard by which submarines were tracked for decades. In documentaries and naval museums, the footage still plays. Blurry black and white reels of engineers standing beside their humming prototype, uniforms replaced by coveralls. They were men and women who had never seen combat, yet their creation fought battles in their stead. Ordinary laborers, machinists, typists, electricians, who unknowingly redrew the boundaries of naval warfare. Their names didn't appear in dispatches or victory communiques, but their fingerprints lived inside every circuit that pulsed beneath the waves. And yet, the moral line remained uneasy. What began as a domestic marvel, a device to bring peace and rhythm to the household, had been turned toward destruction. A motor built to calm life's noise had instead amplified the noise of death. It was the eternal contradiction of human ingenuity. Comfort repurposed for conflict. Logic bent into lethality. In the years that followed, Harold Black returned to civilian work. He never patented his wartime designs. When asked why, he only said, "It belonged to everyone who needed it." His colleagues remembered him as quiet, almost haunted, a man who could no longer hear the hum of a household appliance without thinking of depth charges and oil fires. But his legacy endured, not in weapons but in the idea that creativity knows no uniform. The same hands that built washing machines built sonar. The same equations that cleaned laundry cleared oceans of predators. The war blurred those lines between peace and peril, invention and destruction, leaving behind a strange inheritance, progress born from fear, safety purchased with innovation. Today, when a washing machine hums softly in a suburban laundry room, few think of the sea. Few imagine that its rhythm, that measured, balanced oscillation, once guided warships through the blackest waters on Earth. But the echo is still there, faint and eternal, somewhere between noise and silence. In the end, the sea keeps its secrets, but the machines remember, and in their hum, steady, human, unending, lives the sound of how ordinary people once made the ocean give up its ghosts.